We are not lost, Nancy said. Follow me. With Stalks brushing their shoulders, Nancy led Bess and George to the end of the path. There they saw two more paths going in different directions. Now which way do we go? Bess said. I know the way, George said, and it would lead us straight to Antonio. She pointed to the ground and said, just follow the candy-corn trail. Nancy smiled when she saw the candy. Antonio must have dropped it on his way. True, she said. Sweet, Bess exclaimed. Nancy, Bess, and George followed the candy-corn trail until it led them out of the maze. Standing in the clearing a few feet away was Antonio. How did you escape? Antonio demanded. Only I know the way out of the maze. Only the clue crew knows how to follow a trail, George said of candy corn. Antonio dug his hand into his pocket. Great, he muttered, there's a hole in it. Nancy didn't care how Antonio lost his candy corn. She wanted answers. Antonio, did you ruin our props so we couldn't audition yesterday? Nancy demanded. Because you couldn't audition yourself, Bess added. I don't know what you're talking about, Antonio insisted. We heard you tell Peter you had a messy job to do, Nancy added. It was messy, all right, Antonio muttered. It looked like a hamster foot fight inside the cage. Nancy, Bess, and George stared at Antonio. Hamster foot fight? Bess asked. Are you talking about Squeaky the hamster? George asked our class pet. It was my turn to clean Squeaky's cage, Antonio replied. I promised Miss Ramirez I'd come back to school right after my audition. Antonio then sighed and said, You should have seen all the soggy veggies in Squeaky's cage. Gross. Veggies? Nancy's eyes lit up as something clicked. Hamsters love eating veggies, Nancy told Antonio. And you don't. What are you talking about? Antonio asked. You were looking at vegetables before, Nancy said. But those vegetables were for Squeaky? Antonio clapped his hands over his pocket. Are you saying I took Squeaky? He demanded. He's not in my house if that's what you're asking. I'm thinking he's in your pocket, George said, folding her arms across her chest. Chewing candy corn and a big hole. Antonio rolled his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Squeaky, the girls cried in unison. I borrowed Squeaky for the weekend, Antonio said, holding the little brown and white hamster. I didn't want my mom to find him in my room, so I brought him here. Does Miss Ramirez know you borrowed Squeaky? George asked. No, Antonio admitted. I took Squeaky out after she inspected the cage. With a shrug, Antonio said, I always wanted a hamster, even if it was only for 2 days. Nancy glanced over at Bess and George. She had a feeling they were thinking the same thing she was. Antonio did clean Squeaky's cage on Friday afternoon, so he couldn't have been at Rex and Gags. Why don't you let us take Squeaky back to school, Antonio? Nancy said. Mr. Finney, the custodian, is there on Saturday. Nancy tilted her head and said, Unless you want to return Squeaky yourself and tell Mr. Finley why he wasn't in his cage. Antonio held Squeaky out to the girls. Take him, he said. I didn't know hamster could be so messy, or chew holes in pockets. Thanks, Nancy said, taking Squeaky. And you can keep the veggies you were buying, Antonio. Bess said with a smile. They are good for you. Nancy, Bess, and George found Mr. Drew watching a pumpkin carving demonstration. They asked him to drive them to the River Heights Elementary School. School? Mr. Drew asked. On Saturday? Not for us, Daddy, Nancy said, holding up the hamster. For Squeaky. Mr. Drew drove the girls from the fairgrounds to the school. They would walk home after they dropped off Squeaky. Nancy, Bess, and George each had the same rules. They could walk anywhere as long as it was no more than 5 blocks and as long as they were together. Together was more fun anyways. Hi girls, Mr. Finney greeted them at the door. What brings you to school today? We are bringing Streety back to his cage, Mr. Finney, Nancy said, holding out the hamster. Back? Mr. Finney asked. How? It's a long story, Mr. Finney, George said. On the way to their classroom, Nancy noticed a big banner hanging across the hall. It read, Welcome home, Lucy O'Toole. I put that banner up this morning, Mr. Finney explained, in case Lucy wants to visit her old school. Do you remember Lucy when she went to school here, Mr. Finney? Nancy asked. I'm afraid I do, Mr. Finney said with a little smile. Lucy used to get into a lot of trouble when she was here. Trouble? Nancy asked with surprise. What kind of trouble? Bess asked. Now Lucy is famous for her jokes, Mr. Finney explained. But back then she was famous for mischievous pranks. Nancy, Bess, and George traded stunned looks. Did Mr. Finney just say pranks?